The year is 1215. You're standing on the walls of a Rochester Castle, and the ground beneath your feet hasn't stopped shaking for 3 days. Not from earthquakes, from King John's trebuchets hurling 300-pound boulders at the walls you're supposed to be defending. Your hands are raw from gripping your crossbow. Your stomach is a twisted knot of hunger that stopped hurting 2 weeks ago. Now it's just hollow. The man who stood next to you yesterday is gone. Not dead, not wounded. He simply vanished when a stone the size of a pig turned him into red mist at dawn. But here's what the chronicles won't tell you. He was the lucky one. Because in medieval siege warfare, the mathematics of death were stacked against you in ways that would make modern combat look merciful. We're not talking about a battlefield where you might die in minutes or hours. We're talking about being trapped for weeks or months in what was essentially a stone coffin, slowly filling with disease, starvation, and the inventive cruelty that only medieval warfare could perfect. Whether you were defending the walls or trying to break them down, a siege wasn't just a military operation. It was a marathon of suffering where every single element conspired to kill you. And the only question was which horror would claim you first. The defenders of Rochester thought they were safe behind walls 12 feet thick. The Crusaders at Jerusalem believed God would protect them. The Byzantines at Constantinople had stood invincible for 1,000 years. They were all wrong. And if you had been there with them, wearing their armour, holding their position, believing their beliefs, you would have died with them. This isn't about courage or skill or even luck. This is about the brutal arithmetic of medieval siege warfare, where the human body meets its absolute limits, and those limits always break before the siege does. Let me show you exactly why yes, you, with all your modern knowledge and assumptions, wouldn't have made it out alive. Picture this. You're 3 weeks into the siege. The latrine pits overflowed after the first week, and now human waste seeps into the courtyard where you sleep. Not that you're sleeping much. The enemy's drums haven't stopped pounding since they arrived, a psychological torture designed to shatter your mind before they shatter the walls. The water in the cisterns has turned green with algae, but you drink it anyway because the alternative is death. Actually, scratch that. You're probably going to die anyway, it's just a question of how. The man beside you hasn't stopped shaking for 2 days. It started as shivers, then fever. Now he's mumbling about his mother while bloody flux pours out of him. That's dysentery, by the way. The disease that killed more soldiers than swords ever did. Medieval armies didn't understand bacteria, but they understood that when you pack thousands of men into a confined space with no sanitation, people start dying from the inside out. During the First Crusade, analysis of latrine remains shows that up to 20% of soldiers died from infectious disease and malnutrition before they ever saw combat. 20%. Gone before a single arrow flew. And those were the ones outside the walls. Inside was worse. Take the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. The Crusaders arrived in the scorching summer heat, and the Muslim defenders had already poisoned or destroyed every well for miles around. There was one water source, the Pool of Siloam, and it flowed intermittently. When it did flow, soldiers literally fought each other for access. Men with swords, supposedly brothers in arms, trampling the weak to get a single cup of water that cost a silver coin. The chroniclers describe men with tongues so swollen from thirst they couldn't speak, crawling through mud just to lick moisture from the ground. One Crusader knight wrote to his wife, or rather dictated to a scribe because his hands were too swollen from dehydration to hold a quill, that he had seen men drinking their own urine mixed with vinegar to survive another day. These weren't desperate peasants. These were nobles, men who owned land and titles, reduced to drinking piss because the alternative was death by thirst in the Holy Land they'd come to conquer. But thirst was almost merciful compared to hunger. Your body can survive 3 weeks without food, technically. But after the first week, you're not really surviving. You're decomposing while still alive. Your body starts eating its own muscle. Your mind begins to fragment. At the siege of Ma'ara, Crusaders resorted to eating the corpses of their enemies. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They roasted human flesh over fires and ate it while their priests watched in horror. One chronicler wrote that they boiled pagan adults in cooking pots and impaled children on spits. These weren't barbarians. These were knights and soldiers who weeks earlier had been normal men with normal limits. Siege warfare didn't just test those limits, it obliterated them. The same men who had taken holy vows were gnawing on human bones, and when challenged about it later, one knight reportedly said, "Would you rather we ate our brothers in Christ. Even cannibalism had its twisted logic in the arithmetic of survival. The defenders inside Jerusalem watched this happening from their walls. Imagine knowing that the army outside is so desperate they're eating corpses, and realizing these are the men who will storm your walls if you show any weakness. The psychological warfare went both ways. The Crusaders' descent into cannibalism terrified the defenders, even as it horrified the Crusaders themselves. Now let's talk about what was trying to kill you from outside the walls, because medieval engineers were remarkably creative when it came to dealing death. The trebuchet, basically a massive lever powered by a counterweight, could launch stones weighing 300 pounds over 300 yards. Imagine standing on a wall and seeing a boulder the size of a refrigerator flying toward you. You have maybe 3 seconds to move, except there's nowhere to go because the walls are packed with other defenders. When that stone hits, it doesn't just kill, it liquefies. One Byzantine chronicler at Constantinople described watching a man simply cease to exist when a cannonball struck him. One moment, a soldier. The next, a red splash on grey stone. The psychological effect was devastating. You'd be talking to someone, planning the watch rotation, and suddenly they're gone. Not wounded, not dying. Erased. But stones weren't the only projectiles. Besiegers would launch anything that might break morale or spread disease. Severed heads of captured defenders, meant to terrify. Dead animals already rotting to spread disease. Pots of quicklime that would blind anyone nearby when they shattered. Burning bundles soaked in pitch that would set wooden structures ablaze and fill the air with choking smoke. At the Siege of Nicaea in 1097, Crusaders captured the city's water supply and then launched the severed heads of Turkish defenders over the walls using their catapults. Imagine being a defender and recognizing the head of your brother or friend sailing over the wall. The Ottomans at Constantinople had something even worse. Urban's Basilica, a cannon so massive it required 60 oxen to move and could fire a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. The defenders could hear it being loaded in the Ottoman camp. They had minutes to prepare, to pray, to wonder if this would be the shot that brought down their section of wall. The cannon fired so slowly, only 7 times a day, that each shot became an event, a scheduled appointment with potential death. Between shots, the defenders would scramble to repair the damage, packing the breaches with anything they could find: timber, earth, even their own dead when materials ran low. One account describes defenders stuffing corpses into gaps in the wall, because the bodies, once frozen or dried, provided structure. Imagine being so desperate that your fallen comrades become building materials. The waiting was part of the torture. Medieval commanders understood that breaking mines was as important as breaking walls. The Ottomans at Constantinople would sound drums and cymbals all night, every night. They'd launch false attacks at 2 a.m, forcing exhausted defenders to rush to the walls for nothing. After weeks of this, men started hallucinating. They'd see enemies that weren't there, hear attacks that weren't happening. Sleep deprivation is torture, and medieval sieges weaponized it. At Rochester, King John employed a different kind of psychological warfare. He had captured rebels from other castles brought to Rochester and hanged them in view of the defenders. Every morning, the garrison would wake up to see more bodies swinging from gallows, men they might have known, might have fought beside. The message was clear. This is your future if you continue to resist. But let's say you're tough. Let's say you can handle the hunger, the thirst, the psychological warfare. You're still not surviving, because medieval medicine was essentially guided guesswork with a mortality rate that would horrify a modern veterinarian. Get wounded, even a minor cut. An infection was almost certain. Medieval surgeons didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that arrow wounds festered. Their solution: cut away the rotting flesh with no anaesthetic except maybe some wine, then cauterize it with a red-hot iron. The lucky ones passed out from pain. The unlucky ones survived the procedure only to die from gangrene days later as the infection spread. During the Siege of Rochester, King John's surgeon recorded treating men whose wounds had become so infected that maggots were eating them alive, not metaphorically, actual maggots in living tissue. The surgeon considered this good because the maggots ate the dead flesh. That was peak medieval medical care, hoping insects would eat the rot faster than it could spread. Arrow wounds were particularly nasty. The broadhead arrows used in sieges were designed to cause maximum damage. If the arrow went through flesh, you might survive if infection didn't set in, but if it hit bone, the surgeon would have to dig it out, often shattering the bone in the process. Many men chose to leave arrows in place rather than risk the surgery, dying slowly as the wound festered around the foreign object. Crossbow bolts were even worse. They had enough force to punch through armour, driving rings of chainmail deep into wounds. Removing the bolt meant pulling out each individual ring, turning what might have been a survivable wound into hours of agony that usually ended in death from shock or blood loss. Burns from Greek fire or boiling liquids created their own special hell. Greek fire, a petroleum-based compound that water couldn't extinguish, would stick to skin and keep burning. Defenders at Jerusalem used it against Crusader siege towers, and the screams of burning men could be heard across the battlefield. The only treatment was to scrape away the burning flesh, assuming you could get to the victim before they burned to death. But wounds were almost preferable to disease. Typhus, spread by the lice that infested everyone, could kill 40% of those infected. It started with fever and rash, then delirium. Men would strip off their armour in confusion, wander into enemy fire, or simply collapse and never get up. There was no cure. Medieval physicians tried bloodletting, which just made weakened men weaker. The symptoms were horrifying. One account from the Siege of Antioch describes men whose fever was so high their skin felt like it was on fire. They'd beg for water, but drinking only made the fever worse. Some went completely mad, attacking their comrades or trying to jump from the walls. Others lay in corners, conscious but unable to move, watching lice crawl across their bodies while their minds dissolved into fever dreams. Scurvy was another slow killer. Without fresh fruits or vegetables, vitamin C deficiency would set in after a few weeks. First, your gums would swell and bleed, then your teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds would reopen as the collagen holding your body together broke down. Sailors in later centuries called it the plague of the sea, but it was just as common in prolonged sieges. Men would literally fall apart from the inside, and if plague arrived, game over. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls. Whether that specific act spread the disease is debatable, but plague did break out, and when it did, the siege essentially ended because both sides were too busy dying to fight. Bubonic plague killed 50 to 80% of those infected. You'd wake up with a fever, develop grotesque swollen lymph nodes that turned black, and be dead within days. No cure, no treatment, just prayer and the hope that you'd be one of the lucky 20% who somehow survived. The speed of plague spread in siege conditions was terrifying. One day, a single soldier would fall ill. Within a week, half the garrison could be dead or dying. The bodies piled up faster than they could be disposed of, creating more disease vectors. Rats drawn by the corpses and food stores multiplied rapidly, their fleas spreading the plague even faster. The truly insidious part about siege warfare was how it turned everything into a weapon, including your own side. Friendly fire was common in the chaos of defence. Imagine a night assault, enemies scaling the walls, defenders shooting anything that moves, smoke from burning pitch making visibility zero. At the Siege of Acre, defenders accidentally shot their own returning patrol. During Constantinople, Ottoman cannons sometimes hit their own advancing troops. The confusion was total. In the dark, with the walls swarming with fighters, telling friend from foe was nearly impossible. Passwords were used, but in the heat of battle, men forgot them or couldn't hear them over the clash of weapons. One account from Jerusalem describes Crusaders killing other Crusaders who had scaled the walls from different points, each group thinking the other was the enemy. Treachery was another internal threat. As sieges dragged on and conditions worsened, someone always cracked. At Antioch in 1098, a guard named Firuz opened a tower to the Crusaders in exchange for gold and safety. The entire city fell because one man decided his life was worth more than his loyalty. Every long siege had these moments. Someone would try to cut a deal, and suddenly the enemy was inside the walls because your own side sold you out. The paranoia this created was almost as destructive as the treachery itself. Defenders would eye each other suspiciously, wondering who might be the next Judas. Commanders would rotate guards constantly to prevent any one man from being bribed. Men who had fought together for years suddenly couldn't trust each other. At Rochester, King John discovered one of his own siege engineers was secretly sympathetic to the rebels. and had him hanged on the spot. Even your commanders could doom you. At Constantinople in 1453, the defence was holding until Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese captain, was wounded. When the defenders saw him being carried off the walls, morale shattered. The line broke within minutes. Emperor Constantine threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the melee, dying sword in hand. Noble, certainly. But his death meant the complete collapse of organised resistance. Command structure in sieges was fragile. One dead commander could turn an organised defence into chaos. At the Siege of Orleans in 1428, the English commander, the Earl of Salisbury, was killed by a cannon shot while surveying the city from a tower window. His death demoralised the English army and contributed to their eventual defeat. A single lucky shot changed the course of the 100 Years' War. Here's the thing about medieval siege warfare that modern people don't grasp. It wasn't just about military tactics or technology. It was about pushing human beings past every biological, psychological and moral limit until something finally broke. Usually that something was the human body itself. The stages of deterioration were predictable. Week 1, fear and adrenaline keep you sharp, wounds heal normally, morale is high. Week 2, first food shortages, minor illnesses spread, sleep deprivation begins to tell. Week 3, serious hunger sets in, wounds stop healing properly, first cases of severe disease appear. Week 4, starvation weakness, multiple disease outbreaks, morale begins to crack. Week 5, cannibalism becomes a possibility, mass illness, defensive positions start being abandoned. Week 6, total collapse imminent, surrender negotiations begin if commanders are still alive. Most sieges that lasted beyond 2 months saw the complete breakdown of military discipline. Rules of war, codes of chivalry, basic human decency, all evaporated in the face of starvation and disease. The Siege of Antioch saw crusaders eating grass, leather and eventually each other. The Siege of Leningrad, though much later, followed the same pattern. Civilized people reduced to animals by hunger. The numbers tell the story. At major sieges, casualty rates of 70 to 90% weren't unusual. The Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade lasted 2 years. 2/3 of the crusading army died, mostly from disease and starvation. The defenders fared even worse. When cities fell after long sieges, systematic massacre often followed. At Jerusalem in 1099, Crusaders killed almost everyone in the city. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir wrote that the Crusaders killed more than 70,000 Muslims in the Al-Aqsa Mosque alone. But let's look at what systematic massacre actually meant. When the Crusaders broke through Jerusalem's walls, they didn't just kill soldiers, they killed everyone. Women, children, elderly, the sick. One Frankish chronicler who was there and participated wrote that men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Even accounting for medieval exaggeration, the slaughter was total. Soldiers would go house to house, killing inhabitants and looking for hidden valuables. Some residents tried hiding in cellars or roof spaces, only to be burned alive when the Crusaders set buildings on fire to flush them out. The Temple Mount became a killing ground. Thousands of civilians had taken refuge there, believing the sanctity of the place might protect them. They were wrong. The Crusaders broke in and killed them all, turning one of Islam's holiest sites into a charnel house. Some jumped from the walls rather than face the Crusaders' swords, a fall that meant certain death, but at least it was quick. Let me paint you a specific picture from Rochester Castle, 1215. The siege has dragged on for 7 weeks. The rebels inside have eaten all the horses, they're down to boiling leather for soup. King John has just collapsed the southeast tower by burning 40 pigs worth of fat underneath it, the medieval equivalent of a controlled demolition. The rebels retreat to the remaining half of the keep. Now they're trapped in an even smaller space. No food, no hope of relief, watching their comrades slowly starve. Some try to surrender individually, sneaking out at night. King John has their hands and feet cut off as a warning to the others. These mutilated men are then sent back to the castle, if they can crawl that far, as living examples of what happens to those who desert. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being trapped in that keep, knowing that even surrender might mean mutilation. Some men chose to starve rather than risk John's mercy. Others made suicide pacts, preferring to die by their own hands rather than face whatever creative torment John might devise. Finally, on November 30th, they give up. They're so weak they can barely walk out of the castle they'd defended for 2 months. The The chronicler writes that no one alive can remember a siege so fiercely pressed and so manfully resisted. Translation: even by medieval standards, this was hell. But here's what really gets me. These men knew what they were signing up for. Every medieval soldier understood that sieges were death sentences, yet they did it anyway. Why? Because the alternative, breaking your feudal oath, abandoning your post, meant execution for certain rather than death as merely probable. When your choice is definitely die as a coward, or probably die as a soldier, you pick up your crossbow and take your position on the wall. Medieval society was built on oaths of loyalty. Breaking those oaths didn't just mean death, it meant eternal damnation. The church taught that oath breakers would burn in hell. For a medieval soldier, the calculation was simple. Die honourably in a siege and maybe go to heaven, or break your oath and definitely go to hell. Not much of a choice. The handful who did survive sieges were broken men. We don't have medieval terms for PTSD, but we have accounts of knights who never slept properly again, who flinched at sudden sounds, who drank themselves to death trying to forget. Some took religious vows, as if prayer could wash away what they'd seen and done. Others became mercenaries, moving from siege to siege because normal life no longer made sense after you'd eaten leather soup and watched friends disappear in clouds of stone dust. One English knight who survived the siege of Acre wrote years later that he still woke up thinking he was on the walls, reaching for a sword that wasn't there. He couldn't stand the sound of drums because they reminded him of the Saracen war drums that had pounded for months. He eventually retired to a monastery, but even there, the bells would sometimes trigger memories of alarm bells during night attacks. The Ottomans who conquered Constantinople in 1453 found the city's defenders had scratched messages into the walls during the final hours. Simple things: names, prayers, "Mother, pray for me." These weren't warriors making grand statements. These were men who knew they were going to die and wanted anyone to know they had existed. One inscription, translated from Greek, simply read, "Here died Michael, son of James, May 29th, in the year of our Lord 1453. Remember me, that's all." No grand last words, no defiance, just a desperate hope that someone would remember his name. Hundreds of similar inscriptions were found, a catalogue of the doomed. But perhaps the darkest joke of siege warfare, and medieval soldiers had plenty of dark jokes, was that sometimes winning was worse than losing. Take Constantinople's fall. The Ottoman soldiers who survived the assault then had 3 days of authorised looting and rape. Many died in the chaos of the sack, killed by collapsing buildings, fires they'd set themselves, or fighting other soldiers over plunder. Those who lived often caught diseases from the thousands of corpses rotting in the summer heat. The victorious army that had conquered the last bastion of Rome ended up decimated by the very city they'd won. The logistics of dealing with a conquered city were nightmarish. Thousands of corpses needed disposal, but the surviving soldiers were too busy looting. Bodies rotted in the streets for days, creating perfect conditions for disease. Wells were contaminated with blood and corpses. Food supplies were destroyed in the fighting. The winners inherited a biological time bomb that often killed more of them than the actual siege had. At Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders' victory orgy was so intense that many later died from diseases spread by the corpses they'd created. They'd won the holy city only to turn it into a charnel house that killed them with pestilence. God's ultimate joke on his supposed warriors. The Crusaders had to literally wade through decomposing bodies to reach the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for their Thanksgiving service. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A medieval siege typically meant 20% chance of dying from disease before combat, 30% chance of dying from starvation or thirst, 25% chance of being killed in combat, 15% chance of being executed after surrender, 10% chance of survival, usually with permanent physical or mental damage. Those aren't odds. That's a death sentence with a clerical error that occasionally lets someone walk away. You want to know the single piece of advice that veteran soldiers gave about surviving sieges. Don't be there. Desert before the siege starts. Fake an illness. Claim a religious vision that demands a pilgrimage. Anything to not be inside those walls when the trebuchets start firing and the food runs out. Because once a siege began, death wasn't a possibility. It was a probability approaching certainty. Some soldiers became experts at avoiding sieges. They developed sudden family emergencies when word came that the army was marching to besiege a castle. Others would volunteer for foraging expeditions and simply never return. The smart ones got out early before commanders started posting guards to prevent desertion. The medieval soldier's prayer wasn't for victory. It was for a quick death rather than a slow one. An arrow through the heart rather than dysentery turning your insides to bloody water. A stone that killed you instantly rather than crushing your legs and leaving you to die over 3 days of agony. These weren't warriors seeking glory. These were men trapped in a grinding machine that turned human beings into statistics. Let me leave you with one story from Constantinople. On the last day, May 29th, 1453, Emperor Constantine gathered his remaining defenders. These men knew the walls were breached, knew the Ottomans were coming, knew they were going to die. Constantine reportedly said, "The city is fallen and I am still alive." Then he tore off his imperial regalia and charged into the Turkish ranks with his bodyguard. His body was never definitively identified. He simply vanished into the melee, one more corpse among thousands. Some say a Turkish soldier brought a head to Sultan Mehmed claiming it was Constantine's, but it was so mangled that positive identification was impossible. The last Roman emperor simply disappeared into the apocalypse that consumed his city, becoming legend rather than history. For his soldiers who died with him, there weren't even legends, just anonymous death in a siege that everyone knew was doomed from the start. That's what medieval sieges did to people. They didn't create heroes or villains, they created corpses. Piles and piles of corpses, most dead from diseases that a simple course of antibiotics would cure today. Men who died shitting themselves to death from contaminated water. Knights who survived a dozen battles only to starve to death, eating boiled leather behind walls they'd sworn to defend. The walls of medieval castles weren't just fortifications, they were tombstones waiting to be filled in with names. And if you had been there, with your modern sensibilities, your assumption that humans have limits, your belief that suffering has meaning, you would have been one more name on one more stone, forgotten by history, remembered only as a statistic in some chronicler's account of how a city fell or held. Siege warfare wasn't combat. It was organised, methodical, deliberate human destruction, and nobody, absolutely nobody, was built to survive it. The next time you walk through the ruins of a medieval castle, remember, you're not touring a monument to military engineering. You're standing in a graveyard where the bodies were never properly counted.